I rented the Airbnb out of necessity, not choice. My home was under repair, and this secluded property was the only option within my budget. It wasn't charming or cozy, just a small cabin in the woods, plain and functional. The kind of place you'd expect to find in a crime podcast, not for a weekend retreat. But I was tired and desperate, and the promise of a few quiet days to focus on work sounded like a blessing. The first night passed uneventfully. The quiet was unnerving at first, but I welcomed the chance to finish some long overdue tasks. Morning came with pale sunlight streaming through the thin curtains, and that's when I saw him. A man stood outside the cabin, at the edge of the gravel driveway. His frame was broad, and tattoos snaked up his arms and neck, stark against his pale skin. He wasn't dressed for the cold, just a sleeveless shirt and jeans. His eyes were sharp and piercing, following my every move through the window. I froze. My first instinct was to open the door and confront him, but something about the way he just stood there, still, silent, watching, made me reconsider. Instead, I locked the door, drew the curtains, and waited. After what felt like hours, he left. By evening, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe he was a local, curious about a stranger renting the cabin, or maybe I'd been overreacting. The isolation of the woods was playing tricks on me. I focused on work, trying to push the man's image out of my mind. Then, just as the clock ticked past midnight, I heard it. Faint, deliberate footsteps crunching on gravel. My heart raced. I turned off the desk lamp and crept toward the window. Peeking through the curtain, I saw nothing. But the footprints told another story. In the moonlight, I could see a trail of wet prints leading up the porch and disappearing under the front door. My breath hitched as I turned to the back door, and that's when I saw it ajar, swinging gently in the wind. I grabbed my phone and edged toward the back door, forcing it shut and locking it as quietly as I could. My hands trembled as I dialed 911. Before the call could connect, I felt it, a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw him, the man from the driveway. His eyes were wild, his expression twisted with rage. He didn't say a word, but his intent was clear. I bolted. My bare feet slapped against the cold floor as I flung open the front door and ran into the woods, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. Branches scratched at my face, and the damp ground threatened to pull me down with every step. I didn't stop until I saw flashing blue and red lights cutting through the darkness. The police had arrived, alerted by my unfinished 911 call. They found him not far from the cabin, his face lit with a chilling smirk as they handcuffed him. "Who is he?" I managed to ask through shaking breaths. The officer looked grim. "He's been squatting in that cabin for months. You're lucky to be alive." Later, I returned to retrieve my belongings under police escort. The cabin was eerily quiet, but something caught my eye as I packed my things. A message, scrawled on the bathroom mirror in what looked like charcoal. "Next time, I won't miss." I left that night and never looked back. The man was arrested, but his threat lingers, etched into my memory like a scar. Safety is an illusion, and sometimes even a temporary escape can turn into your worst nightmare. The road ahead was a ribbon of darkness, stretching infinitely into the fog-shrouded Pennsylvania hills. My car's headlights pierced only a few feet into the murk, illuminating the rain that pelted relentlessly against the windshield. The wipers danced frantically, but it was a losing battle. My gas gauge blinked a dire warning, low fuel. I hadn't seen another car or exit for miles. The GPS had long since lost signal, leaving me with nothing but an outdated paper map that offered little comfort. The solitude of the highway pressed in on me, a heavy blanket of isolation that grew thicker with each passing mile. The tires hummed against the wet asphalt, a monotonous drone that only heightened my anxiety. Just as desperation began to claw at the edges of my mind, a flicker of light caught my eye, a neon sign glowing faintly through the veil of rain. Hope surged within me. As I drew closer, the outline of a gas station emerged from the gloom. It was a relic from another era, the kind of place you might see in a faded photograph or an old movie. The sign above read, "Eddie's Gas and Goods," its neon letters sputtering erratically. I pulled into the lot, the car's tires crunching over loose gravel. The pumps stood like silent sentinels, their paint peeling and numbers faded. They were the old mechanical kind, with spinning dials instead of digital screens. I stepped out into the downpour, pulling my jacket tight against the cold. The air smelled of wet earth and rust. I lifted the nozzle and tried to start the pump, but nothing happened. No hum of machinery, no flow of gas, just silence. "Great," I muttered, glancing toward the small building attached to the station. Warm light spilled from a single window, casting a dim glow onto the slick pavement. Maybe someone inside could help. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the place was a time capsule. Dusty shelves lined the walls, stocked with faded cans of soup and outdated snacks. A solitary lamp hung from the ceiling, its bulb flickering and casting long, dancing shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing softly in the confined space. There was no reply. I approached the counter and noticed a bell. I tapped it, the sharp ring startling in the quiet. Still nothing. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, a subtle warning. The atmosphere was thick with neglect, but something else lurked beneath the surface. A sense of abandonment, as if the place had been forgotten by time itself. I decided to leave. Turning back toward the door, I hesitated. Through the rain-streaked glass, I saw a figure standing by my car. He was tall and thin, his clothes drenched and hanging off his frame. His face was obscured by the shadow of a hood, but I could feel his gaze locked onto me. A surge of unease washed over me. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and the parking lot had been empty moments before. "Can I help you?" I called out, stepping onto the covered porch. The rain drummed against the metal roof, masking any sound he might have made. He didn't respond. Instead, he began to walk slowly around the car, trailing his hand along the wet surface. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Look, if you work here, the pumps aren't working," I tried again, my voice wavering slightly. He paused, his head tilting ever so slightly in my direction. The gesture was unnerving, like a predator acknowledging its prey. I decided it was time to leave. I stepped off the porch, my boots splashing in puddles as I made my way toward the driver's side door. The man's head followed my movements, but he remained where he was. Just as I reached for the handle, another figure emerged from around the side of the building. This one was shorter, stockier, and moved with unsettling speed. His clothes were torn, and his face was contorted into a grimace. In his hand glinted a sharp object, a knife. Panic ignited within me. My heart pounded in my chest as adrenaline surged through my veins. "Hey, stay back," I shouted, fumbling with my keys. The second man broke into a sprint, charging toward me with feral intensity. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it just as he reached the car. The blade scraped against the window, a shrill sound that sent shivers down my spine. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine coughed but didn't start. "Come on," I screamed, turning the key again. The engine roared to life. The first man was now standing directly in front of the car, blocking my exit. His hood had fallen back, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I had no choice. I threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning on the wet gravel before catching traction. The car lurched backward, and I spun the wheel, narrowly avoiding the gas pumps. Shifting into drive, I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The car sped forward, and I swerved to avoid the first man. He didn't move, didn't even flinch as I barreled past him. In the rearview mirror, I saw both figures standing in the rain, watching as I fled into the night. The highway was a blur of darkness and rain. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and my knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't dare slow down, fear propelling me forward. After what felt like hours, the rain began to let up. The fog lifted slightly, and I spotted the welcoming glow of a truck stop ahead. Relief flooded over me. I pulled into the brightly lit parking lot and parked near the entrance. Safe at last. Inside, the warmth and bustle of the diner were a stark contrast to the cold isolation I'd just escaped. I sank into a booth, still trembling. A waitress approached, her smile fading as she took in my disheveled appearance. "You okay, honey?" she asked, concern evident in her eyes. I think so," I replied shakily. "Just a coffee, please." As I sipped the hot liquid, I debated whether to call the police. What would I even tell them? That I'd been chased by two men at a gas station that seemed lost in time? Curiosity gnawed at me. Pulling out my phone, I searched for Eddie's Gas and Goods in the area. No results. I waved the waitress over. "Excuse me, have you ever heard of a place called Eddie's Gas and Goods around here?" She frowned thoughtfully. "Can't say I have. Been working here 20 years, and the only gas station on this stretch is the one down the road." "I just came from there," I insisted. "It's old, kind of run down. Two guys were there, She placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Sweetie, this highway's been quiet ever since they built the new interstate. Folks don't travel this way much anymore. Maybe you got turned around?" I didn't press the issue. After paying, I returned to my car. Under the harsh lights of the parking lot, I noticed a long scratch along the passenger side, a deep gouge that hadn't been there before. So it was real. Sleep was impossible that night. I checked into a motel, the events replaying in my mind on an endless loop. The hollow eyes of the man, the feral charge of his companion, the eerie stillness of the gas station. The next morning, driven by a need for answers, I decided to backtrack. In daylight, perhaps things would make more sense. I retraced my route, the landscape unrecognizable in the morning light. The road was still isolated, but without the cloak of darkness and rain, it felt less sinister. As I approached where I believed the gas station had been, I slowed down. There was nothing. No building, no sign, not even a turnoff. Just dense woods lining both sides of the highway. I pulled over onto the shoulder, heart pounding. This was the spot. I was certain of it. Climbing out of the car, I ventured cautiously into the trees. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. After a few yards, I saw it. A crumbling foundation overgrown with moss and vines. Rusted metal beams jutted out at odd angles, and scattered debris hinted at what might have once stood there. Among the rubble, I spotted an old, weathered sign half buried in the underbrush. Pulling it free, I brushed off the dirt to reveal faded lettering, Eddie's Gas and Goods. A chill ran through me. "Excuse me," a voice called out, startling me. I turned to see an elderly man walking toward me, a dog trotting at his side. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said kindly. "You lost?" "Not exactly," I replied. "I'm trying to find out what happened here." He gave me a curious look. "Not much to tell. The place burned down nearly 50 years ago. Tragic story, really." "What happened?" I pressed. He sighed, gazing at the ruins. Owner was a man named Eddie. Ran the place with his brother. One night, a traveler stopped by, never did find out his name. Something happened. A fight, maybe. The place caught fire, and all three perished. Locals say their spirits still linger, though I don't put much stock in ghost stories. My mouth went dry. Do people ever see figures around here? He chuckled softly. "You're not the first to ask. Over the years, a few folks claim to see lights or shadows. But like I said, just stories." I thanked him and returned to my car, my mind racing. As I drove away, a sense of unease settled over me. The scratch on my car, the abandoned foundation, the old man's tale, they all pointed to something unexplainable. Back on the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees seemed to close in, their branches stretching like skeletal hands. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, static filling the car. I glanced down in surprise. It had been off. Amidst the static, a faint voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." My blood turned to ice. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, I pressed down on the accelerator. The static grew louder, the voice repeating the ominous warning. I reached out and twisted the knob frantically, but it wouldn't turn off. "Leave," the voice hissed, more insistent. "Stop," I shouted, fear gripping me. Ahead, the fog began to thicken unnaturally, a wall of white swallowing the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. The engine died abruptly, and the radio fell silent. The only sound was my ragged breathing. Through the windshield, figures emerged from the fog, the two men from the gas station. They stood motionless, their faces obscured, yet I could feel their eyes boring into me. I fumbled for the keys, trying to restart the car. It sputtered, but refused to turn over. "Please," I whispered, not sure who I was pleading with. The figures began to move toward me, their steps slow and deliberate. Desperation took hold. I locked the doors and closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. A loud honk jolted me awake. My eyes snapped open to see a truck pulling up beside me, the driver leaning out the window. "You okay there?" he called out. "Car trouble?" I looked around frantically. The fog was gone, and so were the figures. The engine was purring steadily. The car had never stopped running. I'm fine," I stammered. "Just thought I saw something." He gave me an odd look. "Be careful. These roads can play tricks on you, especially if you're tired." "Yeah, thanks," I replied, forcing a weak smile. He nodded and drove off, leaving me alone once more. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Had it all been in my head? A hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep? But as I adjusted the rearview mirror, I froze. Scrawled across the back window, etched as if by a finger drawn through condensation, were the words, "Don't come back." I didn't hesitate this time. I drove straight to the interstate and didn't stop until I reached the safety of the city. Years have passed since that night, but the memories remain vivid. I avoid lonely highways and never travel without ensuring I have a full tank of gas. Sometimes, when the night is dark and the road is empty, I catch a glimpse of a neon sign flickering in the distance, and I press down on the accelerator, determined to outrun whatever waits at the gas station that wasn't there. It began as a spontaneous adventure. Kevin and I had always bonded over our mutual love for urban exploration, dilapidated factories, forgotten railway stations, even a derelict amusement park once, all places that whispered stories of the past. But this time, it was different. A friend of Kevin's had mentioned the abandoned village during a late-night conversation, describing it as eerily modern. Unlike the weather-worn ruins we usually sought out, this place was built recently, or so it seemed. The project had been mysteriously abandoned, leaving behind empty streets and houses that stood frozen in time. No one knew why. The story was enough to tempt us, and within days, we set out. The road to the village wound through dense woods. The further we drove, the more Kevin's enthusiasm gave way to unease. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The GPS had failed us miles ago, and we relied on vague directions scrawled on a piece of paper. "There," Kevin said suddenly, pointing. A break in the trees revealed the village, nestled in a clearing. The houses were strange, modern but unkempt, their sleek lines and large windows contrasting with the overgrown vegetation. A sense of abandonment hung heavy in the air, an oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of gravel under our tires. We parked near what might have been a community square. A rusted playground stood off to the side, its swings swaying gently in the breeze. The sight was oddly unsettling. "Ready?" Kevin asked, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. He tried to sound confident, but his voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. "Let's make this quick," I replied, my eyes scanning the eerily quiet surroundings. The first house we entered was pristine on the outside but hollow within. The walls were bare, and the floors creaked beneath our steps. A layer of dust coated everything, disturbed only by faint footprints, too faint to belong to us. "Looks like someone else has been here recently," Kevin muttered, crouching to examine the marks. I didn't reply. My attention was drawn to a kitchen counter where a cup sat, upright and spotless, as though waiting to be used. It didn't fit the abandoned atmosphere. "Let's check upstairs," Kevin suggested, breaking the uneasy silence. The second floor was much the same. Empty rooms with peeling paint and broken light fixtures. But as we were leaving, a faint sound stopped us in our tracks. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the first floor. Kevin froze, his wide eyes meeting mine. Neither of us moved, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just beneath us. "Who's there?" Kevin called out, his voice shaking. No reply. We crept to the staircase and peered down, expecting to see someone. The space below was empty. "Maybe we imagined it," I whispered, though my gut told me otherwise. Then came the voice, low and raspy. "I just want to talk." My blood ran cold. The sound wasn't distant. It was near, too near. Kevin grabbed my arm. "Let's go." We descended the stairs as quietly as possible, hearts pounding. The front door yawned open, and the cool evening air greeted us like a warning. Kevin led the way outside, but I hesitated. Something caught my eye, footprints in the dust on the floor. They led from the door to where we had stood upstairs, but there were no prints leading back. We decided to check one more house, convinced that someone was playing a cruel prank. The second house was similar in layout but darker, the windows partially boarded up. Kevin shone his flashlight around, illuminating empty shelves and discarded furniture. The beam landed on something strange, a photograph lying face down on the floor. He picked it up and turned it over. The photo showed a group of people standing in front of the very house we were in. They smiled warmly, holding signs that read, "Welcome to the neighborhood." They must have been the original owners, Kevin said, studying the faces. "Kevin," I said, my voice trembling, "look at the window." In the photo, a figure stood in the upper window of the house, half hidden behind the curtain. Their face was blurry, but their eyes, dark, void of emotion, seemed to burn through the image. Before we could process it, the sound of footsteps returned, this time circling the house outside. We froze, listening as they moved from one side to the other, accompanied by a low muttering we couldn't make out. Kevin bolted for the door. "We're leaving. Now." I followed, glancing over my shoulder as we ran. Outside, the light was fading fast, casting the village in an eerie twilight. The woods loomed ahead, our car parked just beyond them. We didn't make it far before we heard it again, the voice. "I just want to talk." It echoed unnaturally, coming from every direction at once. Kevin grabbed my arm, pulling me into the tree lane. The branches clawed at us as we ran, the oppressive silence of the woods amplifying every rustle and snap beneath our feet. Behind us, the footsteps followed. They didn't belong to one person. It sounded like a crowd, closing in fast. "Don't stop," Kevin gasped. "Keep moving." But the woods seemed endless. No matter how far we ran, the village stayed within sight. its dark outlines visible through the trees. "Something's wrong," I whispered, slowing down. "We're going in circles." Kevin spun around, his face pale. "No, that's not possible." The voices began again, a cacophony of whispers, all saying the same thing: "I just want to talk." We bolted, running blindly through the darkness until, miraculously, the car came into view. Kevin yanked open the driver's door, and I threw myself into the passenger seat. As the engine roared to life, the whispers grew louder, almost pleading. The last thing I saw before Kevin sped away was a group of figures standing at the edge of the woods, their faces obscured by shadow. One of them raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. At a small diner, we sat in silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. Kevin fidgeted with his phone, attempting to find any mention of the village online. "It doesn't exist," he said finally, his voice hollow. "There's no record of it anywhere." I didn't respond. My thoughts were stuck on the footprints, the photograph, and the haunting words that seemed to cling to the air around us. When we returned to campus, we agreed never to speak of it again. But weeks later, I found something chilling. While unpacking my bag, I discovered the photograph Kevin had picked up in the house. I didn't remember taking it, yet there it was. This time, the figure in the window was gone, but written across the back of the photo, in faint, spidery handwriting, were the words, "Next time, don't run." I arrived at the Airbnb late in the afternoon, the sun dipping below the Wyoming mountains as snow began to fall. The cabin was small and cozy, its wooden exterior blending seamlessly with the surrounding pines. It was the kind of place you'd see in a travel ad, promising peace and solitude, a retreat from the noise of everyday life. Inside, the place was simple but welcoming. A crackling fireplace, a plush armchair by the window, and a single bedroom with a heavy oak bed. I dropped my bag on the kitchen counter and brewed myself a cup of coffee, already relishing the quiet. The host had left a handwritten note by the fridge. It read, "Welcome. The snow can be heavy at night, so make sure you lock all the doors and windows. Enjoy your stay." I didn't think much of the warning. After all, I was miles from the nearest town. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of wind and the faint creak of the cabin settling into the cold. The first night was uneventful. I curled up with a book by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones as snow piled against the windows. By the time I went to bed, the world outside was a blank canvas of white, and I slept deeply, undisturbed. It was the second night when things began to feel off. I was sitting at the small dining table, finishing up dinner, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It came from somewhere within the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking a loose shutter, but as I sat still, listening, the noise became irregular, like footsteps, soft and deliberate. I stood, the creak of the floorboards beneath me merging with the sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. Nothing. The sound stopped. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the snowstorm outside was playing tricks on my ears. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, closer. The tapping seemed to come from the closet in the bedroom. I froze, my hand clutching the edge of the blanket as my heart raced. For several long moments, I debated whether to investigate or stay safely in bed. Finally, curiosity, and perhaps a misplaced sense of bravery, won. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and crept toward the closet. Each step felt heavier than the last, the wooden floor groaning under my weight. The closet door was plain, unremarkable, but something about it filled me with dread. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I reached for the handle and pulled. It didn't budge. Frowning, I tried again, yanking harder. The door remained firmly shut, as though something on the other side was holding it closed. I backed away, my breath shallow. This is ridiculous, I whispered to myself, but no amount of self-reassurance could erase the growing tension in my chest. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. Whatever had caused the noise didn't return, and by morning, I convinced myself it had all been a product of my overactive imagination. But the unease lingered. When I returned to the bedroom that evening, I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint scuff marks on the floor near the bed. They were irregular, as though something heavy had been dragged across the wooden boards. My mind raced with explanations, most of them rational, all of them unsatisfying. I decided to check beneath the bed. Lying flat on my stomach, I peered into the darkness. My breath caught. There was something there. A pile of belongings, tucked neatly out of sight. Clothes, a pair of worn boots, a battered backpack. None of it was mine. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. Someone had been here. Or worse, someone still was. I reached for my phone, ready to call the host or the police, when a new sound froze me in place. This one wasn't a tap or a creak. It was the unmistakable groan of the closet door opening. Slowly, my legs refused to move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but fear rooted me to the spot. I turned, my eyes locking onto the bedroom door, expecting to see someone step out. And then he emerged. He was tall and unkempt, his clothes rumpled and his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. His eyes were hollow, sunken, but his mouth curved into an unsettling smile. "Sorry about the mess," he said casually, as though we were old friends. He knelt by the bed, reaching beneath it to retrieve his belongings. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body was paralyzed with terror, every muscle locked in place. He slung the backpack over his shoulder, stuffing a pair of socks into his coat pocket. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, still smiling. "I'll be out of your way now." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the cabin. I listened as he opened the front door, the cold night air rushing in, and left. The door clicked shut behind him, and silence fell once more. It was several minutes before I dared to move. My legs wobbled as I stumbled to the front door, locking it and every window in the cabin. I spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch, clutching the fireplace poker like a lifeline. Morning came, and with it, the courage to leave. I packed my things quickly, my eyes darting to every shadow as I hurried to the car. When I reported the incident to the host, she sounded genuinely horrified. "That's impossible," she insisted. "There shouldn't have been anyone there." Later, I learned the cabin had once been part of a larger property, abandoned years ago. Rumor had it that vagrants sometimes used the empty buildings for shelter during the harsh winters, but no one could explain how he had gotten in, or how long he'd been there before I arrived. To this day, the thought haunts me. What if I had gone to bed earlier that night? Would I have woken up to find him standing over me, smiling that same unnerving smile? I'll never stay in an isolated cabin again. Some escapes just aren't worth the risk. The Cascades were my sanctuary, a place where the world's noise faded into the rustle of leaves and the rhythmic crunch of boots on dirt. This trip was meant to be no different. 3 days of hiking remote trails, camping under a canopy of stars, and conquering the peak that had eluded me on past attempts. On the second day, I met him. His camp was nestled in a small clearing off the trail, a simple setup, a single tent, a modest fire pit, and a beat-up aluminum pot steaming over the flames. He waved as I approached, his face illuminated by the warm glow. "Heading to the peak?" he asked, his voice cheerful but laced with a subtle weariness. "Yeah," I replied, adjusting the straps on my pack. "What about you?" He nodded. "That's the plan. Been here a couple of days, trying to time it with the weather. Name's Paul, by the way." I introduced myself, and we chatted for a while. Paul seemed ordinary enough. Mid-30s, a rugged look that suggested he spent more time outdoors than in. He offered me coffee, and we shared stories of past hikes. When I mentioned my plan to summit the peak the next morning, he seemed genuinely interested. "Mind if I tag along?" he asked. "Not at all," I said, thinking it might be nice to have some company for the grueling ascent. We agreed to meet at sunrise and parted ways, me returning to my campsite a little further up the trail. The night passed peacefully, and I woke with a sense of excitement for the day ahead. Paul never showed. I waited for an hour, pacing by the trailhead, glancing back toward the direction of his camp. The thought crossed my mind that he might have overslept, but something about it didn't sit right. He had seemed eager, almost too eager, to climb the peak. It wasn't like him to bail. Curiosity, or maybe concern, got the better of me. I decided to backtrack to his campsite and check on him. When I arrived, a strange unease crept over me. The camp was deserted, but it didn't look abandoned. The tent stood intact, the fire pit cold but neatly arranged, the aluminum pot washed and placed on a rock. His pack leaned against a tree, fully packed as if ready to go. "Paul," I called out, my voice swallowed by the forest. No response. I ventured closer, peeking into the tent. Inside was a sleeping bag, unrolled but neatly laid out, and a flashlight beside it. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet Paul was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had simply vanished. As the afternoon wore on, I debated my next move. Part of me wanted to leave, report the situation to the rangers, and let them handle it. But something about the scene gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that I owed it to Paul to figure out what had happened. That's when I saw it, a faint, flickering light deeper in the woods. It was subtle, barely visible in the gathering dusk, but unmistakably there. A headlamp, perhaps? Or a fire? My first thought was that it could be Paul, but the rational part of me questioned why he'd be out there alone, off-trail. "Paul!" I shouted, moving toward the light. It didn't respond, but it didn't vanish either, as if waiting for me to follow. Against my better judgment, I did. The woods grew denser, the undergrowth clawing at my legs as I pushed forward. The light remained tantalizingly ahead, always just out of reach. It flickered in an unnatural way, not like a steady beam, but as if something was obstructing it, casting shifting shadows across the trees. I stopped to catch my breath, suddenly aware of how far I had ventured. The trail was long behind me, and the silence of the forest pressed in like a suffocating blanket. Even the usual rustle of leaves and chirping of birds had ceased. The light blinked out. Darkness enveloped me, sudden and complete. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my flashlight, cursing under my breath. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing nothing but endless trees. And then I heard it, a faint rustle, the sound of movement nearby. "Paul," I whispered, though I already knew it wasn't him. The rustling grew louder, circling me, deliberate yet erratic. My flashlight swept the area, catching fleeting glimpses of branches swaying, shadows shifting unnaturally. Then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the edge of my light, barely discernible. It was tall and motionless, its face obscured by the dark. The headlamp was strapped to its forehead, the beam now off, but its faint glow still reflected in its unblinking eyes. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching. "Paul." I tried again, desperation creeping into my tone. This time, it moved. A slow, deliberate step forward. Panic took over. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, my flashlight bouncing wildly. The sound of pursuit followed, heavy footsteps pounding the ground behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, every instinct screaming to keep moving. I burst onto the trail, the familiar path a lifeline in the chaos. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Only when I reached my campsite did I glance back. The forest was silent once more. The figure, if it had ever been there, was gone. The next day, I hiked back to the trailhead, my mind racing with unanswered questions. I reported what I'd seen to the rangers, describing Paul and his deserted camp. They assured me they would investigate, but their skepticism was clear. A search party combed the area over the next few days, but found no trace of Paul or the mysterious figure. His belongings were still at the campsite, untouched, as if waiting for him to return. Weeks later, I received a call from the rangers. They had closed the case, labeling Paul's disappearance as inconclusive. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the one I'd expected. Even now, the Cascades feel different to me. What once brought peace now carries a weight of unease. I still hike, but I avoid the remote trails, wary of what might be waiting in the shadows. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about that light in the woods and the figure that led me astray. Was it Paul? Or something else entirely? I'll never know, but I can't shake the feeling that, somewhere out there, the forest still holds its secrets and its watchers. Living alone was supposed to be a dream come true. After years of shared apartments and cramped dorm rooms, I finally had my own space, a modest two-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. I could decorate however I wanted, leave dishes in the sink, and game late into the night without worrying about waking anyone. The first month was bliss. The silence, the solitude. It was exactly what I needed. But then the noises started. At first, they were small, easy to dismiss. A faint creak in the middle of the night, a distant thud when I was in the shower. Old building, I told myself. The walls settle, the pipes rattle. It's nothing. But as the weeks went on, the sounds grew harder to ignore. One evening, as I sat at my desk immersed in a game, I heard a soft knock, not on the front door, but deeper in the apartment. I froze, my headphones slipping off my ears as I strained to listen. The knock came again, this time fainter, like it was coming from inside the walls. Probably the neighbors, I muttered, shaking off the unease. But the seed of paranoia had been planted. Things escalated a few days later. I'd been up late, working on a project for my freelance gig. Around 2 a.m., I got up to grab a drink from the kitchen. As I walked down the hall, I caught it out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, fast and deliberate. Someone, or something, darted past the doorway of my gaming room. My body went cold. I stood frozen in the hallway, every nerve screaming at me to run. But my feet wouldn't move. Slowly, I turned to face the gaming room, my heart hammering in my chest. Hello? My voice trembled, barely audible. No response. Gathering what little courage I had, I stepped into the room. The computer screen cast a faint glow over the desk, but the room was empty. I checked the closet, under the desk, even behind the curtains. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The following morning, I decided I'd had enough. I searched the entire apartment, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The living room, kitchen, and bathroom were exactly as I'd left them. My bedroom was untouched. That left only the second bedroom. The second bedroom was more of a storage space, filled with unpacked boxes and furniture I hadn't decided what to do with yet. I rarely went in there, but as I opened the door, the smell hit me. Stale sweat, faintly sour, and unmistakably human. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The boxes had been moved, stacked in a way I didn't remember arranging. In the corner, beneath a pile of old blankets, I saw it. A small, crumpled sleeping bag. Beside it was an assortment of items. Empty water bottles, snack wrappers, a phone charger plugged into the wall. Someone had been living here. Panic surged through me as I backed out of the room. My mind raced. How long had they been here? Who were they? And, most horrifyingly, had they been watching me? I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. They arrived quickly, searching the apartment and taking photos of the makeshift camp. The officers assured me they would investigate, but admitted it would be difficult to find the intruder if they were already gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. I sat in the living room clutching a kitchen knife, jumping at every sound. When morning came, I packed a bag and left, staying with a friend while I figured out what to do next. A week later, I returned to the apartment with a locksmith to change all the locks. As I walked through the empty rooms, a chill ran down my spine. Something about the place felt wrong, as though the walls themselves were watching. In the second bedroom, I found a note taped to the inside of the closet door. The handwriting was scrawled, barely legible, but the message was clear. Thanks for the stay. Nice gaming setup. My stomach dropped. The thought that they'd been watching me, listening, perhaps even standing just outside my door as I gamed late into the night, was unbearable. I moved out 2 weeks later, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The police never found the intruder, and I stopped asking for updates, preferring to let the nightmare fade into obscurity. To this day, I double-check every lock and closet, even in my new place. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm gaming and the house is silent, I catch myself glancing at the doorway, half expecting to see a figure darting past. Because now I know, even in the safest spaces, you're never truly alone. Delivering food late at night wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills and let me set my own hours. Most nights were uneventful. College students with midnight cravings, night shift workers ordering coffee and sandwiches, or the occasional suburban family forgetting to cook dinner. But this delivery was different. It was 12:45 a.m. when the notification came through. A single meal, ordered from a 24-hour diner, destined for an office building in the industrial part of town. The address was odd. Those buildings were usually deserted at night, but people worked strange hours sometimes. I accepted the order without a second thought and drove through the empty streets, the glow of my GPS lighting the way. The office building loomed ahead, a gray monolith against the cloudy sky. Its windows were dark, save for a faint glow on the first floor. The parking lot was almost empty, except for a single car parked near the entrance. I grabbed the bag of food, double-checked the address, and approached the glass doors. To my relief, they weren't locked. A soft chime echoed as I stepped inside, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. The lobby was dimly lit, with outdated furniture and a reception desk that looked untouched for years. A single flickering fluorescent light buzzed above me. I glanced at the delivery instructions. Bring to the second floor, staircase to the left. A chill ran down my spine as I looked toward the staircase. It was shrouded in darkness, the kind of pitch black that seemed unnatural. The elevator wasn't an option. It was cordoned off with yellow tape, a sign reading, "Out of order," dangling precariously. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. No response. That's when I saw him. A man emerged from a shadowed corner of the lobby, his sudden appearance making me jump. He was tall and gaunt, his face pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that made him look like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were plain, a gray hoodie and black jeans, but his presence was anything but ordinary. "You're the delivery guy," he said, his voice low and flat. It wasn't a question. Yeah, got your order right here," I replied, holding up the bag. He didn't take it. Instead, he nodded toward the staircase. "Second floor. Just leave it there." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, calm, cold, like he was rehearsing a line in a play. His eyes didn't meet mine, instead fixating somewhere past me, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. "You sure you don't want to take it here?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. He shook his head slowly. "Second floor," he repeated. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the bag. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I didn't want to risk a bad review or a complaint to my boss. "Okay," I muttered, forcing myself to move toward the staircase. The darkness enveloped me as I ascended the steps, each creak of the wood echoing ominously. I turned on the flashlight on my phone, the beam barely penetrating the oppressive gloom. Halfway up, I stopped. There was a sound above me, soft, shuffling footsteps. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The footsteps stopped. My pulse quickened. For a moment, I considered turning back, but I didn't want to appear paranoid. With a deep breath, I continued up, my footsteps slow and deliberate. When I reached the second floor, my flashlight swept over a long hallway lined with closed doors. The air was colder here, and the silence felt suffocating. I spotted a table near the far end of the hall and hurried over to it, placing the bag down with trembling hands. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A shadow moved beneath one of the doors, followed by a faint whispering sound. "Okay, I'm out," I muttered under my breath, bolting back toward the stairs. The flashlight flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I was plunged into darkness. When it came back on, I thought I saw something, a figure standing at the end of the hall. I didn't stick around to confirm. I ran down the stairs, taking them two at a time, nearly tripping in my haste. When I reached the lobby, the man was gone. The only sign he'd been there was the faint smell of cigarettes lingering in the air. I sprinted to my car, locked the doors, and sped off, my hands shaking on the wheel. Back in the safety of my apartment, I tried to calm down, convincing myself it was nothing, just a creepy guy in a creepy building. But the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. The next morning, I received a message from the diner. The customer had complained that the food was left in the wrong place. Furious, I called the restaurant to explain what had happened. That's when the manager mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "The office at that address has been closed for years," she said. "Are you sure that's where you were?" I hung up, my heart racing. Desperate for answers, I pulled up the address on Google Maps and found a phone number for the property manager. When I called, a tired-sounding woman answered. "That building's been vacant for over 3 years," she said. "No one's rented it since." I asked about the man I'd seen and the lights on the second floor. She paused before replying, her voice cautious. "You're not the first delivery driver to say that, but when we check, there's never anyone there." I couldn't leave it alone. I contacted a friend who worked security and asked if they could check the CCTV footage for the building. 2 days later, they sent me a clip. It showed me walking into the lobby, standing nervously as the man spoke to me. But what chilled me to the core was what happened next. As I climbed the staircase, 2 figures emerged from the shadows on the second floor, their faces obscured by hoods. They stood motionless, watching me place the food on the table. Then, as I turned to leave, they disappeared back into the darkness. I never delivered to that part of town again. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that building, or why they wanted me to go to the second floor. All I know is that I listened to my instincts and got out. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the footage in my mind, haunted by the thought of what might have happened if I'd stayed a moment longer. The cabin's visitor. The remote cabin had seemed like the perfect getaway. Tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, it promised the peace and solitude my wife, Sarah, and I desperately needed. After months of stressful jobs and city noise, the idea of disconnecting for a week sounded like heaven. No phones, no internet, just us and the forest. The first few days were idyllic. We spent our mornings hiking the surrounding trails and our evenings by the fireplace, sipping wine and listening to the gentle rustle of leaves outside. The silence of the wilderness was unnerving at first, but we quickly grew to appreciate its stillness. It wasn't until our third night that the cabin revealed its darker side. The evening had been uneventful. Sarah had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long hike, while I stayed up reading by the fire. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the shutters and howling through the trees, but inside, the cabin was warm and cozy. At some point, I heard it, the faintest creak above me. I froze, my eyes darting toward the ceiling. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen on the roof, or the wind had shifted something. But then it came again, a distinct, deliberate thud. Footsteps. I put my book down and listened intently. The sound was unmistakable now, slow, measured steps pacing across the roof. I glanced toward the bedroom, debating whether to wake Sarah, but she hated being startled, and I didn't want to alarm her unnecessarily. Instead, I moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The moonlight illuminated the clearing around the cabin, but nothing seemed out of place. The car was where we'd left it, the woods still and silent. The footsteps continued, circling above me. They weren't hurried, nor erratic. Whoever, or whatever, it was moved with an eerie calm, as though they had all the time in the world. I crept back to the bedroom and shook Sarah awake. Her eyes fluttered open, a mix of confusion and irritation. "What is it?" she mumbled, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "There's someone on the roof," I whispered. Her expression shifted instantly, sleep replaced by fear. "Are you sure?" "Listen." We both held our breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were fainter now, as if the person had moved toward the far end of the cabin, but they were still there, steady, deliberate. Sarah sat up, her face pale. What do we do? Should we call the police? I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, only to remember there was no signal out here. I'll go check outside, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Are you insane? She hissed, grabbing my arm. If someone's out there, we don't know what they want. She was right. The rational thing to do was to stay put, lock the doors, and wait. But the thought of sitting in silence while a stranger prowled above us was unbearable. I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and positioned myself near the front door. The footsteps shifted again, this time to the center of the roof. They paused, as if the person was standing directly above us, listening. Minutes stretched into eternity. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the back of the cabin, then stopped abruptly. I waited, gripping the fire poker tightly, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving than the sound of movement. What are they doing? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, I admitted, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. Maybe they're trying to scare us. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Whoever this was, they weren't trying to break in. If they'd wanted to, they could have done so easily by now. No, this was something else, a game, a performance designed to unnerve us. And it was working. Finally, after what felt like an hour, the footsteps stopped completely. I waited, my heart pounding, but there were no more sounds. No creaks, no rustling, nothing. I approached the window again, peering outside. That's when I saw it. A figure emerged from the woods behind the cabin, stepping into the moonlit clearing. They were tall, their features obscured by a heavy coat and hood. They didn't look back at the cabin, didn't glance toward the windows where I stood watching. They simply walked into the forest, disappearing into the trees. I exhaled shakily, relief washing over me. They're gone, I whispered. Sarah joined me at the window, her eyes scanning the clearing. Are you sure? I saw them leave, I said, trying to convince both her and myself. It's over. Morning brought no comfort. When the sun rose, we ventured outside to investigate. The snow on the roof bore the unmistakable pattern of footprints, circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. Around the perimeter of the building, more tracks led to and from the woods. We followed the trail to where I'd seen the figure disappear. It continued deep into the forest before abruptly stopping. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of where the person might have gone. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. We reported the incident to the local authorities when we returned to town. The officer we spoke to was sympathetic, but offered little reassurance. These cabins attract all kinds, he said, scribbling in his notepad. Could have been a drifter, someone looking for a place to stay. They probably didn't mean any harm. Then why didn't they knock? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Why walk on the roof in the middle of the night? The officer had no answer. Weeks later, we received a call from the sheriff's office. They'd investigated the area but found no leads. No missing persons, no reports of suspicious activity. The case was closed, leaving us with nothing but questions. To this day, we don't know who or what visited us that night. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, certain I can hear the faint sound of footsteps above me, circling slowly. It's a sound I'll never forget. Living alone has its perks, peace, quiet, and the freedom to do as you please. But that night, my solitude became a nightmare. It started as an ordinary evening. I had just finished watching a late-night movie and was too tired to head to bed. Instead, I dozed off on the couch, the flickering light of the TV casting faint shadows across the living room. When I woke up, the TV was off. That was strange, but not alarming. I figured the auto-sleep function had kicked in. What was alarming was the man sitting on my couch. He was positioned across from me, perched casually on the armrest like he belonged there. His face was pale, his eyes unblinking, and his lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach those eyes. He was dressed in plain clothes, a faded hoodie and jeans, but something about him felt profoundly wrong. My heart stopped as our eyes met. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming, that this was some half-formed nightmare. but the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog told me I was awake. Very awake. "Good evening," he said softly, as if greeting an old friend. I couldn't speak. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How had he gotten in? The doors were locked, or at least they should have been. Who was he, and why was he here? "You're finally awake," he continued, his tone calm and conversational, like this was the most natural thing in the world. "We've been waiting for this moment." I bolted upright, my body trembling. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice cracking with fear. His smile widened. "Why don't you come sit over here? Let's talk." He gestured to the empty space beside him on the couch, patting the cushion as if inviting a guest to join him. The casualness of his demeanor only made it more chilling, like a predator luring its prey. "No," I stammered, backing toward the door. "Get out of my house." He didn't move. His gaze followed me, and his smile never faltered. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. I didn't wait for him to make a move. I turned and sprinted for the front door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the deadbolt. As I struggled, I heard him rise from the couch. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one sending a jolt of terror through me. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge of mockery. "We were just getting started." Finally, the lock gave way, and I yanked the door open, bursting into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran barefoot across the lawn to my neighbor's house, pounding on the door like my life depended on it. Mr. and Mrs. Green, an elderly couple, opened the door, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm when they saw me. I must have looked deranged, wild-eyed, barefoot, and trembling. "There's someone in my house," I gasped. "Call the police." Mrs. Green ushered me inside while Mr. Green grabbed his phone. They sat me down on their couch, their voices soothing as they tried to calm me, but my eyes remained fixed on the window, half expecting to see the man's face staring back at me. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights illuminating the quiet street. 2 officers entered my home, while another stayed to question me. I told them everything: the stranger's calm demeanor, his unsettling smile, and his invitation to talk. The officer's brow furrowed as he jotted down notes, his serious expression only heightening my fear. When the officers returned, their report left me even more unnerved. They had found no one in the house. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. The front door had been left ajar, but otherwise, everything was as I'd left it. "You're sure you locked the doors before going to sleep?" one officer asked. "Yes," I insisted, my voice trembling. "I always lock them." They exchanged glances but didn't say anything more. After searching the surrounding area and finding nothing, they advised me to stay with a friend or neighbor for the night and left, promising to patrol the area. I spent the night at the Greens' house, unable to close my eyes. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the image of his smile, the way he had looked at me like he already knew how the night would end. The next morning, I returned home to find everything as I'd left it. Everything except for one thing. On the coffee table where the man had been sitting was a single object I didn't recognize, a playing card. The Joker. The police were called again, but they had no explanation. The locks on my doors were intact, the windows secure. There was no way someone could have entered without leaving a trace. Weeks turned into months, and though I moved out of that house shortly after, the memory of that night still haunts me. Who was he? How had he gotten in? And, most chillingly, what did he mean when he said, "We've been waiting for this moment"? I'll never know the answers, but every so often, when I catch a glimpse of a stranger in a crowd or hear an unexpected knock at the door, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next moment. Driving for Uber in the evenings wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Most nights were predictable: bars, restaurants, airport pickups. But occasionally, a ride would come through that broke the monotony. It was just past midnight when the request appeared on my screen. a pickup on the outskirts of town. The destination was listed simply as the farmhouse. Curious, I zoomed in on the map. The location was miles away from any major roads, surrounded by fields and forest. I hesitated but accepted. The payout looked promising, and I figured it was just some farmhand heading home. As I left the city lights behind, the roads became narrower, the houses fewer. My headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating nothing but endless stretches of empty fields. The sense of isolation grew with every mile. When I arrived at the pin, I was greeted by the silhouette of a sprawling farmhouse. It sat in the middle of a vast, overgrown field, its peeling paint and sagging porch giving it an air of abandonment. There were no lights on, no signs of life except for a lone figure standing by the driveway. He was tall and thin, his features obscured by the shadows. He wore a dark coat, his hands tucked into the pockets. As I rolled to a stop, he stepped closer, his face finally coming into view. Pale skin, hollow cheeks, eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "You're here for me," he said. It wasn't a question. Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Where to?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned and gestured toward the farmhouse. "Just up there." I hesitated, glancing at the darkened house. "The pin says the ride's done here. Do you want me to drop you closer?" He shook his head slowly. "No need. You can come in if you'd like. Just for a moment." His words sent a chill through me. Something about his tone. It wasn't inviting, but commanding, as if declining wasn't an option. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I didn't want to seem rude or, worse, cowardly. I stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel. "I think I'll wait here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Suit yourself." He turned and began walking toward the farmhouse. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though he was waiting for me to change my mind. As he reached the porch, the front door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness inside. He paused in the doorway, looking back at me. The open door gaped behind him like a mouth, inviting but menacing. Then he stepped inside and disappeared. I sat frozen in the car, staring at the open door. My mind raced. Maybe he was waiting for me. Maybe I should go check, just to be polite. But every instinct in my body told me to stay put. There was something deeply wrong about this place. Minutes passed. The door remained open, the house silent. No lights came on, no movement from within. It was as if the man had been swallowed whole. A sudden rustling in the nearby field snapped me out of my daze. I turned my head, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just the tall grass swaying in the wind. Or so I told myself. That was it. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was going on. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the driveway, my eyes darting between the house and the surrounding darkness. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The entire ride home, my mind replayed the scene over and over. The man's hollow gaze, the creaking door, the silence that followed. I debated reporting the incident, but what would I even say? That a man asked me to come into a creepy house and I didn't? There was nothing illegal about it, just wrong. For days, I tried to put it out of my mind, but curiosity gnawed at me. Who was that man? Why was the house dark? What would have happened if I'd gone inside? A week later, I couldn't resist. I searched online for any mention of the farmhouse. To my surprise, I found an old news article about a property matching its description. It had been abandoned for over a decade, ever since the family that lived there disappeared without a trace. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises from the house at night. Footsteps, whispers, sometimes the faint sound of laughter. The police investigated but found nothing. The case remained unsolved. My stomach turned as I read the final line of the article. Local legend says the farmhouse lures people in, but not all who enter are seen again. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I had stepped inside. Part of me is glad I'll never know. But late at night, when I'm alone in my car, I sometimes glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a pale, hollow-eyed man sitting in the back seat, smiling that faint, unsettling smile.